Hello and welcome to Subject to Change with me, Russell Hogg. My guest today is James Howard Johnston. James was on the podcast recently to talk about the last great war between the Persians and the Romans, which lasted from 602 to 629. And James has very kindly agreed to come back to talk about what happened next. So welcome back, James, to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me back. In a way, the last great war of antiquity is simply a prelude to the quite extraordinary events that occurred over the next 20 years. I've long been fascinated with them, and I suppose it was some 30 years ago that I began to take a close look at the evidence and began to come up with some ideas. I should say right at the start that some of the ideas are heterodox. I hope that they won't cause offence. I'm referring to the explosion of religious and military energy from within the Arabian Peninsula, which followed the end of the last Great War within 4 years. The events of the years 634 to 652 were, I think, quite unprecedented. The Arabs, powered by a new religion, Islam, conquered most of the Roman Empire, its richest provinces in the Middle East, and the whole of the Sasanian Persian Empire.
Before we get there, should we not give Heraclius his moment in the sun? There he is in Jerusalem in the year 630. Tell us about Heraclius, his moment of triumph.
I'm very glad you've pulled me up at that point. Yes, it was Heraclius' great triumph. He'd brought about a coup d'état in the Sasanian capital in 628, and then had finally reached a settlement with a short-lived Sasanian regime in 630. And he came to Jerusalem with the fragments of the True Cross. By the way, one fragment of the True Cross was said to be on the Russian cruiser the Moskva, which was sunk last week in the Black Sea. Anyway, Heraclius is clearly bringing back a rather larger chunk,
with much the same result,
to Jerusalem. And on the 21st of March, 630, a day fraught with significance, being the day on which time began, the day of the creation of the sun and the moon, which also was the Persian New Year festival of Nowruz. Heraclius comes in a triumphal ceremony into Jerusalem, goes up onto the Temple Mount, then crosses it, descends and goes to the church, the great church, the Holy Sepulchre, and restores the cross to its rightful place. So, a day of glory. He probably, in my view, planned for the first time to place a Christian monument on the Temple Mount, which the Romans had hitherto avoided. They'd avoided building anything on it, which I think was going to be a triumphal column representing, with pictures of Joshua's conquest of the Holy Land, being a sort of a biblical precedent for Heraclius's. He then, over the following 2 years, managed to bring about a grand reconciliation of all the fractious Christian confessions of the Middle East. The greatest triumph being the celebration of a joint liturgy in Alexandria, where the Copts and the Orthodox jointly celebrated, which I think took place in 632.
But as you say, there was this explosion out of the Arabian Peninsula. So what was going on what was in the Arabian Peninsula? Can we say a bit about the Arabs at this stage, or do you want to skip to some other part of the story?
No. We should. We've got to pay attention to the Arabs. But I tell you, I think right at the start, we should just remember that there's a great confusion reigning in the sort of scholarly world about what value you attach to Arab sources. So what I'm going to be doing in everything that follows is basically using the non-Arab sources as a control on the Arab sources. So what can one say about the Arabs? Well, I should also say that I do read Arabic, but my Arabic is pretty rudimentary. I mean, I've learnt it so as to be able to look at key passages for myself. But I can, under no circumstances, be described as an Arabist. So whatever I say about the Arabs is being said by an outsider to Arab studies, but an outsider with a deep interest in the subject. And I think I'm pretty well read. And I may also be a pioneer in certain respects. But on the whole, the professional Arabists don't seem to pay, or to have paid hitherto, much attention to what I have written. And I wrote a certain amount in my book, the Witnesses to a World Crisis, Historians and Histories of the Middle East in the 7th Century, which has not shaken them up. So you ask about Arabs. Now, the word Arab basically is a word designating an outsider, a troublesome outsider. And it's a word that was used both by people living in the lands to the north of Arabia, as well as people living in South Arabia, what is now Yemen and Oman, going round to the Gulf, the better watered bit of Arabia, which gets the edge of the monsoon with much more agriculture and where there was a developed city life. So the Arabs basically are the strangers, the outsiders. It's what the Greeks called their enemies and outsiders, barbarians. And it's the word that is still attached as Berbers to the wilder elements in North Africa.
And is it a very populous part of the world? Because I always get this idea of that area as being effectively a desert, and I sort of imagine there being not very many people there. I have no real understanding of the geography of the area, but I sort of imagine it being a thinly populated area, and this idea that it can take on, world empires seems extraordinary.
You're quite right. You're absolutely right. I mean, the only sort of reasonably populated areas were those that got seasonal rains, the monsoon rains. So the southwest, the south, and a bit of the southeast. For the rest, basically elevation. The higher the land, the more precipitation. So they would get basically in the form of dew at night. So now the desert in general, the elevation goes down from northwest to southeast. So the northwestern edges of the desert, which shades into the cultivated lands of Palestine and Syria, is much higher than the northeast. So there was much more grazing there. So there could be more animals there. So there could be more humans there. So if one is looking at Arabia in terms of population density, the most densely populated areas were in the south. They were sedentary. They were really quite distinct from the Arab. I mean, they are viewing the Arab as outsiders. They've got languages which are Semitic, but are not closely related to the languages of the interior of Arabia and the north. So you've got the south, densely populated with cities, temples, and so on. And then the next area of, the next most densely populated area is the area running up on the western side of Arabia, which includes the Hijaz, where we're located, or Mecca and Medina, and goes on up to the eastern edges of the Roman Empire, so the edge of Palestine and Syria. And I would say that of this western swathe, probably the largest gathering of nomads, moving around, Bedouin, moving around through the was in the northwest. because that's where the grazing was most extensive and most continuous through the year. So the natural power centres of Arabia were the south and the northwest. But that's not where the story of the rise of the Arabs began.
So where does the story of the rise of the Arabs begin?
The first beginning is in the northeast, where the desert is much lower. It's on the edge of the ancient Mesopotamia, modern Iraq, and the economic and political heartland of the Sasanian Persian Empire. And the Persians gave their support to a particular dynasty, to a particular grouping of Arabs, the Lakma, and they had a fixed capital at Hira, and a whole series of client peoples and others through which they extended Persian influence over the northeastern desert, and basically providing a Bedouin shield for Persian Mesopotamia. And it was at their capital, Hira, that the Arabic script and Arabic literature in the form of pre-Islamic poetry flourished through the 5th and 6th centuries. So Hira and the Lakma were of the three sort of power centers on the edge of of Arabia. Hira was by far the most important culturally, and culture is itself, of course, important to the history of any people. They were the two other. I just quickly slip this in, that the Romans had their own client peoples based on the northwest, the Ghassan. And the Ghassan, being based on the northwest, tended in conflict to have the edge over the Lakma, the Persian clans. But then there was a third power in the south, on the southern edge, so on the edge of rich South Arabia, the Kinda, who you have these three client peoples trying to manage the interior, sparsely populated interior of Arabia. But the cultural centre lay surprisingly in the northeast.
When you describe all that, none of that seems particularly threatening to either Persia or Rome. They have the Ghassan, I think you called it. The Romans work very closely with them. You have the Lakma, who seem to be working very closely with the Persians, and everything seems to be under control.
Indeed. And then, as you've rightly said, the interior of Arabia is, compared to Syria, Palestine, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the highlands of Iran, Anatolia, the Balkans, the eastern outliers of Iran in Khorasan, the northwestern outliers in Azerbaijan. Arabia it's a nothing. It's almost a semi-void. So what on earth happened to galvanize the population of this sparsely populated area into marching out, obviously to their doom, if to face the Roman and Persian armies? Now, some people say that there was a great opportunity because both the great powers had fought a long war, as you said, from the fighting went on from 602 to 629, so that they're exhausted. And the outside world is just there waiting, vulnerable, perfect prey to be fed on by these Arab, these outsiders, the wandering nomads, much accustomed to raid and counter-raid. To my mind, that makes no sense at all, because the Roman army, it was a small elite force, had won a quite extraordinary victory at the end of a long war, which had, for many, many years was a war which they were losing, being driven steadily back to their heartland in Anatolia. They were buoyed up by victory. And as for the Persian armies, they'd not been defeated. They'd been strategically outwitted and that had led to a coup d'etat. But the armies themselves, the armies of occupation in the Middle East, had not suffered. They'd been somewhat humiliated. They'd been forced under the treaty eventually agreed that restored the peace, to withdraw from the whole of the Roman Middle East. But they'd not been defeated. So there are huge Persian armies, there are victorious Roman armies, and these are the forces which the Bedouin and South Arabians from this sparsely populated huge peninsula conquered.
So what's driving this exit from the peninsula, this attack on the Roman and Persian empires? What's caused this explosion?
Well, it should be obvious to anyone, but it's not much stressed by the professional Arabists, that we're dealing with something quite unprecedented in human history, which is only explicable by the effect of faith on the morale and motivation of the Arabs. The effect of faith on their morale, their motivation, and the effect of faith in bringing them together into a coherent whole. I think anyone who denies this is basically denying the evidence of their own senses in the 21st century, where we can see still the extraordinary effects on individuals and groups of a submission to a particular version of Islam. So the number one explanation is faith, and that means we have to go back to the Prophet Muhammad, and who began to receive his first messages around about the year 610, and who at first was very troubled by the messages he was receiving. They resulted in utterances as he passed them on, rather terrifying, about the end of time, the end of the world, wholesale destruction of mountains and seas and of everything growing and living in it. He was very troubled by this. He resented it. He resisted it, but eventually accepted it and took on the role of the prophet, the apostle of God, the apostle of Allah, and became in effect the mouthpiece of God on earth. Now, this starts in the visions and the messages start around about the year 610, after some 12 years in which Muhammad's utterances, they stir up things in Mecca. He and a small band of followers were forced to leave. This is called the Hijra. It's in 622 AD. It's the date from which all Muslims, the Muslim calendar begins. It's the emigration from Mecca to Medina. At Medina, they basically established, it's called the Constitution of Medina, and it's a document which I think not even the most sceptical of historians deny reflects the agreement that was made, the Constitution of Medina. And it basically it's a deal between the immigrants, who are very few, not much more than 100, and the population of Medina, which is a sprawling oasis. And the different tribes of Medina, which included Jewish tribes, they basically all agreed to cooperate and to accept Muhammad as the sort of arbiter. There then follow 6 years of conflict between the immigrants, that is the Muslims, at Medina, backed by their Medinan helpers, the Ansar, against Mecca, until in 628 a crucial meeting took place which resulted in the cessation of Meccan hostilities against Medina and vice versa. It's a very, very interesting moment, and it's the key to understanding, I think, everything that subsequently happened. And 2 years later, Muhammad and an army from Medina approached Mecca and were admitted to the city. 2 years later, on the 8th of June, 632, Muhammad was dead. Now, in giving this very brief schematic account of the life of the prophet, I am relying upon what's known as the Sirah, or the biography of the prophet. And that was put together in the 8th century, so about 3 or 4 generations afterwards, by Ibn Ishaq, and was then revised by a character called Ibn Hisham later in the 8th century. And that's the form in which we find it. So there's quite a gap between Muhammad's lifetime and the composition of the text. But from first reading it, I've been inclined to put my faith in the general sequence of events given by the Sirah and the sort of key historical points that one may extract from it, because it includes material discreditable to the prophet. His resentment of the mission that is being given to him, and then extraordinary information which it gives about the negotiations in 628, which preceded the agreement between Mecca and Medina. So I'm inclined to support it, to put faith in it, and also one can check it against outside sources for particularly 3 important 6th century episodes where basically it is corroborated. So this text contains the biography of the prophet, but it gives some background history of the circumstances, and one can corroborate it on the background history.
I did read, as part of the preparation for this, I read Tom Holland's book In the Shadow of the Sword, and I think he's much more sceptical than you are of the biography of Muhammad. And he places things much further north, I think, because he makes the point a lot of the key characters, for example, have estates in Syria. Now, I may be getting his argument muddled up, but I would just be interested if you would respond.
Not at all. It's interesting. He basically looks back to the sceptical trend among Arabist Islamic historians, which was prevalent, I think, from the 1960s, probably through to the year 2000, dominated the scholarly literature. There were ultra-skeptics who basically denied that the Quran was the text which contained the messages that Allah had received. And the most extreme of them there was a man called Wansborough, whose brother, I think, was a monk of Ampleforth. But Wansborough went wild and said, that the text is a sort of concoction put together in the 8th century. And so did a very, very distinguished Islamicist, Patricia Croner. Now, those are the real extremists. Then you have the moderate skeptics, who took a perfectly reasonable view, which is that you have, whenever you're using a historical text, to pay attention to the time at which it was written, the circumstances at which it was written, the concerns prevalent at the time when it was written. And they argued that the notion that there was some sort of centralized political authority able to manage affairs in the early phase of the conquests was basically simply a reflection of what they were familiar with in the 9th century, and that the portrayal of the rise of Islam and then the early conflicts within Islam were influenced by the tensions and conflicts of their own day. Now, it's true of all historians, of course. You can't escape completely from your own time. On the other hand, all historians do their best to do so, and in my view, they succeed to quite a large extent. So I'm speaking about, history of England, Europe, America, China, whatever. And I see no reason to suppose that the Muslim historians would have been much more susceptible to the distortions and biases of their own time than we, for a very simple reason. They're Muslims. The events of Muhammad's lifetime were absolutely crucial to their whole existence. So I am sure they were striving to get at the truth. And the second thing, of which I'm absolutely sure of, is that so extraordinary were the events that followed the agreement between the exiles, the immigrants, and Mecca, that no contemporary could have basically forgotten the events and the lifetime of the Prophet. So all I'm saying is that the absolutely crucial points in the initial formulation and dissemination of Islam were, I'm sure, remembered correctly. And those crucial points are the start of the visions, secondly, the effect within Mecca, thirdly, the hijrah to Medina, and then in the Medinan period, 3 military clashes of significance between the immigrants and the Meccans. Badr, the Battle of Badr in 624, when the Muslims were aiming to attack a Meccan caravan, but were themselves attacked. And then the Battle of Uhud in 626, which was a defeat for the Muslims. And then in 627, a siege of Medina. Now, I said it's a sprawling oasis, so it's not a siege in any sort of medieval sense. It's basically a blockade from a large Meccan and allied force that has established itself outside and, in effect, blockading, isolating, threatening Medina. And then the negotiations at Hudaybiyah in 628, this crucial moment, and then the entry of Muhammad into Mecca in triumph in 630, after which he throws out the idols from the great pagan pilgrimage centre of the Kaaba.
And what I heard or read somewhere, I can't remember it was in your book or elsewhere, is that the Meccans perhaps take the deal because their centre remains the centre. There may only be one God, but all the pilgrimages and all the trade remains centred on Mecca.
Yes, indeed. That's the... I'm just going to retreat for a moment, going back to this basic question of how did the population of a sparsely inhabited region basically conquer the neighbouring world and go on to do much more. And I said faith, that motivation, extraordinary power to drive, to inspire and invigorate soldiers, individuals. But on the other hand, you need organisation. And it is, I think, it is the combination, and this is the point that I think is my essential, absolutely essential point. It's the coming together of the faith of the immigrants, which has spread in Medina, and the organisational capability of Mecca that creates this mixture which had this extraordinary effect. But, of course, sceptical Islamicists and others become very sceptical about the notion of Mecca as a city-state, a great centre of commerce, able to sending out, great caravans of trading goods north, basically to the Roman frontier provinces, which would be carrying precious commodities from South Arabia, frankincense and myrrh, and so materials for incense and unguents. And so there's been the skeptics have attacked that. Now, they face two particular problems. One is that there's enormous prosperity evident on the edge of the Roman provinces in the Middle East, on the edge of Syria and Palestine. All sorts of towns are booming on the edge of the desert in the 6th century. Secondly, that the Quran, as a distinguished scholar at the end of the 19th century said, basically breathes the atmosphere of the counting house. It's come from a mercantile milieu. And then thirdly, if one can corroborate parts of the Sirah, before its account of Muhammad and Muhammad's life, for what happened in North Arabia and what happened in South Arabia, one is inclined to pay attention to what it says about Mecca and the Hijaz. Mecca and the Hijaz, which formed, as it were, an island unaffected by the projection of Roman power, Persian power, slightly affected by the projection of power from the south, but basically an island of independent Arabs within Arabia. So I think that the picture given of a great trading city with a mercantile elite, well aware of the surrounding world because it has contacts with them, able to organize complex arrangements with a multitude of Bedouin tribes to enable the caravans to pass safely north, probably engaged in the Indian Ocean trade too. There's plenty of references to ships plying their way across the seas in the Quran. So I think the notion of Mecca as a political centre of real importance, a trading centre of real importance, and a religious centre, a pagan religious centre of great importance, the principal shrine, pilgrimage shrine of Arabia, the Kaaba, lying close to the original city. All of that, I think, is, I mean, we may doubt various details, but the general picture is reliable and acceptable.
And the Quran itself, that feels like that's got more weight as an authentic document of the time.
Yes, indeed. There were late 20th century, early 21st century, a lot of work was being done on traditions about the formation of the canonical version of the Quran. The good arguments were putting for the general view at the end of the 7th century was that the Quran was taking shape in the caliphate of Umar and Uthman, basically in the caliphate of Umar. So they're pretty much achieving its final form by 644.
So very soon after the death of Muhammad.
Those were the traditions. And the scholars, it's particularly a scholar called Schurler, looking at the substance of the tradition, and then the line of authorities from whom it was derived, argued that these traditions had taken firm shape, had already existed by the late 7th century. So one should then be inclined to believe them. There have also been radiocarbon dating of parchment sheets of the Qurans with a 95% probability, which date the existence of the Quranic text by the 650s. So there's absolutely no doubt that the Quran is, I think, it is a collection of the utterances of the Prophet. And that means it's by far the most important source.
And yet I've heard it said that it sort of exists outside history and geography when you read it.
Well, no, I don't think so. It certainly doesn't. Look, I'm much enjoying the dialogue. It doesn't exist outside geography because the geography of Arabia, the flora, the fauna of Arabia, the rocks, the desert, this suffuses the whole text, and it's one of the arguments for God's supreme, God's power, all-encompassing power, which is produced again and again in the Quran, is the argument from the terrain, from the landscape, and the fragile life upon the landscape. And as regards time, well, there is a deep sense of time because Muhammad is simply the latest of a series of prophets. I mean, he's aware of Old Testament prophets, but also of Arabian prophets. Many who have been disregarded by those to whom they spoke. So there's a great sense of time, and there are also references to contemporary events. I'm just going to check that a crucial, the Battle of Uhud and Badr are very clearly referred to in Surah 3. So it's one of the two very, very late surahs. The Persian victories over the Romans are referred to in it. And, there's a lot of reference to the reactions of those who heard Muhammad to what he was saying, both within Mecca and within Medina, to unbelievers and to peoples of the book, Christians and Jews. So I would say that there is a great deal of allusion to what was going on at the time, and an extraordinarily deep awareness of place, geography, and of deep time.
Can we just go back to the negotiations between Muhammad and the Meccans? Because I think that's a terribly interesting subject.
Yes, indeed. I'll tell you how I came to the view that I've reached. It happened, as often happens to historians at Oxford and Cambridge, where we still have the tutorial system, that in discussion with the pupils, I became more and more convinced that there was something very peculiar with the account given in the Sirah about these negotiations. You see, the Sirah, I'm not saying that these sources are completely unbiased, of course not. But what I am saying is that a lot of the particulars that come through are genuine. So the Sirah basically gives an account that all the concessions were being made by the Meccans to the Muslims. Inhabitants of Mecca that wanted to move to Medina were going to be allowed to do so. The Muslims at Medina were going to be allowed to communicate and basically to preach, proselytize among the tribes of Arabia. War was going to cease. I haven't got the full list of them in my mind, but those are the two most important ones. Basically, the blockade of Medina was being lifted. That's fine. On the scenario, which is also the scenario given in the Sirah, that the battles and the fighting, confrontation between Medina and Mecca was something to be gone in the favour of the Medinans. But actually the accounts of the conflicts to which I've already referred give quite the contrary impression. There's a raid which goes wrong, but where the Muslims manage to win a battle, and then basically a defeat and an actual physical blockade about which they can do nothing. So it's quite hard to understand why all these concessions would have been made in this political situation. But then there's one. There are two points made in the Sirah, which mean this is, the whole scenario is wrong, because it's rather an interesting passage in the Sirah. It talks about the actual phrasing of the document, the treaty document, and it comes to 2 points where the Muslims objected to the suggested phrasing, and the first concerned Muhammad. And the Muslims, of course, wanted Muhammad to be the apostle of God. And the Meccans said no. They refused. And they said Muhammad shall be referred to by his kin, his place in the kinship system of Mecca. And the Meccans got their way. And secondly, even more important, the Muslims, of course, wanted the reference to Allah, to be to Allah, the supreme and only God, all-powerful, all-knowing, etc. And the Muslims said, no. Allah is one among several, basically among 3 senior gods and many other gods. And the Muslims got their way.
The Meccans got their way.
Sorry, the Meccans got their way. Absolutely. So this seems to be a quite extraordinary, it's an extraordinary moment when all the concessions are made by the Meccans, but the Meccans, from the circumstances and also from this particular passage in the Sirah, have got the whip hand. So what on earth is going on? And it was only late in the course of writing my book, The Witness in the World Crisis, that I finally worked it out. And I'm afraid, and I have to confess, that the Quran's the chronologically earlier surahs in the Quran, which tend to be shorter than the later ones, and much more dramatic. Those are the ones where there's a positive message is produced that the world is going to come to an end. Individuals are going to be judged before the supreme deity. The supreme deity has all power. The prophet has no power at all. He's simply his messenger. We get that, as I say, it's very, very plain what is being said. It's extraordinarily persuasive and forceful. And in contrast to this, the last surahs are very, very long. They're much more down to earth. There's much more polemic against Christians and Jews and unbelievers. There is much more, let's say, much more giving out of prescriptions. Basically, Surah number 2, I think a good half of it is basically a law code for Muslims. It's probably the latest, the latest of them. So they're not tremendously enticing. So I'm afraid I only read the last surahs of the Quran, the long. I don't want to say they're duller. They're more down to earth. I only read them very, very carefully, and I have to say, in English translation, I mean, the Quran is very, very difficult Arabic. So basically, the organisation of the Quran, the modern organisation is that the latest surahs are the earliest surahs in any edition, and the earliest, the very short and troubling and indeed terrifying ones at the end. But this is very roughly the inverse of the chronological order of the Prophet's utterances. A distinguished Islamicist called Nicholas Sinai, who's at Oxford, has done a thorough study of the Quran and the chronology of the surahs. And from that, one can be absolutely certain that the surahs, that certain surahs that give guidance as to provide the explanation of why the Meccans with the whip hand gave these extraordinary concessions to the Muslims. The explanation for that can be found in the Quran. So,
well, come on.
Well, I'll start with the surah, and then I'll go to the Quran. Now,
just for the listeners, the surah, the Quran, is the surah a verse in the Quran?
A surah is basically a chapter of the Quran.
Right.
And then the chapters have verses. And one of the key criterion for dating surahs is the length of the verse. So the surahs themselves get longer, and the verses within them get longer as we go on through time. And there is a change of substance, more polemic and more prescription in the later ones, and also more militancy. But if we go back to the life of Muhammad as written down in the 8th century and revised in the late 8th century, there's one crucial piece of information, what happened just before the negotiations. And that, I think, is what explains everything that followed. Muhammad left Medina with companions and announced that he wanted to go on the little pilgrimage. And the Meccans' agreement to allow him to go the following year, 629, is taken to be another Meccan concession. But of course, it wasn't. It was the huge concession that Muhammad had made, faced with circumstances in which the Muslims in Medina were isolated, blockaded from the rest of Arabia. This was a huge concession which he made. He was indicating by the declaration he wanted to go on the little pilgrimage that the new religion was ready to incorporate the pilgrimage and the Kaaba, which sort of signified Mecca's special place in the world, to incorporate it into the new religion. So it's a quite extraordinary concession being made by the Prophet, which then gets the Meccan reciprocal concessions. So,
but he must have been a man of enormous power in terms of his charisma and persuasiveness, because for the Meccans to be taking him as seriously as they are, I mean, it's quite an extraordinary thing for one man with effectively very few followers.
Oh, no, indeed. Muhammad, the divinely inspired Muhammad, is one of the most extraordinary human beings who ever lived. One of the striking things about Muhammad is, at no point did he claim to have any sort of special miraculous powers. So he is a man who simply got a role which has been given to him by Allah. And early on, many of his arguments with the Meccans are, they say, perform a miracle for us, do this, do that. And he says, no. I'm simply a man. I'm simply conveying, I'm a prophet. I'm simply conveying what I need to convey, what has been given to me from above. This makes, I'm afraid this is an aside, the hadith that provide so much guidance to Muslims, have provided so much guidance to Muslims subsequently. The hadith are records of what Muhammad said and did as a man. And basically, they should have no relevance to the conduct of Muslims. He was simply one man among others. It's what he said, he uttered, which was recorded in the Quran. That is the sacred text. And the Quran itself accepts the New Testament and the Old Testament as also divine publications. So those should be the scriptures which determine behavior. And that indeed is the view of Shia Muslims. I mean, they don't attend to the Hadith. They attend to the Quran and then allow for individual inspiration for the thinking and reasoning of Ayatollahs. But still, to return to Hudaybiyah. So on the basis of what is recorded in what I think is a generally reliable account on the crucial points, and this is a crucial point, that is the seerah, the biography of the Prophet. The concession being made by Muhammad was that he would accept the pagan sanctuary into the new religion, along with all the associated rites. So one has to emphasize that the Kaaba was the principal, premier pagan sanctuary in Arabia. And within it, there were idols of the whole range of gods. So Muhammad is accepting that. Quite extraordinary for a universal religion where there should be no special place on earth. There was a special people, the Arabs, to whom the message was being given in the first instance, but no special place on earth. But that one then looks to the Quran and to the latest surahs. And I'm just going to... This is the old Penguin translation. This is the pre-Salman Rushdie translation, when the surahs, that is the chapters, were put in rough chronological order. And it's what I read when I first read the Quran. And so that Surah 2 is here right at the end of the text. So it's sort of quite a way in, about halfway into Surah 2, that Abraham, who is, of course, who's featured often in the Quran, comes to the fore. So, and I'm reading it. I'll skip a bit, but just to give the sense. When his Lord put Abraham to the proof by enjoining on him certain commandments, and Abraham fulfilled them, he said, "I have appointed you a leader of mankind." "And what of my descendants?" asked Abraham. "My covenant," said he, "does not apply to the evildoers." We made the house, the Kaaba, that is, a resort and a sanctuary for mankind, saying, "Make the place where Abraham stood a house of worship." We enjoined Abraham and Ishmael to cleanse our house for those who walk round it, who meditate in it, and who kneel and prostrate themselves. "Lord," said Abraham, "make this a land of peace, and bestow plenty upon its people, those of them that believe in Allah and the last day." And then I skip. Abraham and Ishmael built the house and dedicated it, saying, "Accept this from us, Lord. You hear all and you know all. Make us submissive to you. Make of our descendants a nation that will submit to you. Teach us our rites of worship and turn to us mercifully, etc. Now, the point is that the building of the Quran, of the Kaaba, by Abraham is here described fully, for the only time in the Quran, in one of the last surahs.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there is, to be learned, there is a chance reference to the Kaaba. It's not in as direct a term as this. In an earlier surah, it's actually number 14, which is placed in the midst of some Meccan material. But it is, because of the greater precision and the weight of evidence from these last surahs, this is generally thought to be a piece of Medinan material inserted into an earlier Meccan surah. So I'm just saying that there can be no doubt about that the account of the building of the Kaaba by Abraham, who features a lot and who has nothing to do with the Kaaba, nothing is said about him in the Kaaba until this late surah. So that's the first point. So what I'm basically saying is this, that after the concession made at Hudaybiyah, the rationalization was that the Kaaba had originally been a monotheist sanctuary, which had subsequently been sort of polluted and become polytheistic. But this is only introduced very late into the Quran. And so I think it provides pretty strong negative corroboration for the Surah. The second important part of the Surah, I won't read it, comes in Surah 22, which is entitled The Pilgrimage. Now in this, it's a surah which starts off, it's fun, it's another sort of mixture of early and late, but it starts off with passages about God's power, illustrating God's power, then gives detailed instructions for how the Muslim pilgrims are to behave when they go on pilgrimage. Basically, they are to behave exactly as the pagan pilgrims would. They're to dress, sober dress. They're to take sacrificial animals. They're to decorate the sacrificial animals in the same way. They are to circumambulate the Kaaba in the same way. They are to sacrifice the animals. But they should know that it's not the blood and the meat that will please Allah, but their thoughts. The Prophet then gave instructions on how to behave, so incorporating the whole paraphernalia of pagan worship and pilgrimage into the new religion.
So in a sense, it's a reverse takeover.
Yes.
It appears to be a concession, but actually it turns into a takeover.
Yes. One can confirm that because at the end of the First Civil War, which went on between 656, the death of Uthman, the Caliph Uthman, and 661, which involved the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, Ali, against basically two other parties. The victor in the end was the son of the leading Meccan, of Abu Sufyan, who negotiated with Muhammad at this time. And so that the dynasty, the Umayyad dynasty that ran the caliphate from 661 through to the Abbasid revolution in the 740s was Meccan.
So it's a joining together.
There was one other thing that had to happen, and I think that happened before Muhammad made his the concessions were made, and this was that the Qibla shifted from Jerusalem. The Qibla is a direction of prayer, and the direction of prayer was towards Jerusalem after the emigration for a time.
Why do they pray towards Jerusalem? Why is it a holy place for the Arabs?
Because it was a holy place for the Christians and for the Jews, and the peoples, and their two books are sacred books. And so it was the extraordinary thing was the shift of the Qibla from Jerusalem to Mecca, to the Kaaba, to the pagan sanctuary of Arabia. Now, in the same surah, number 2, where there is the account of the Abraham and Ishmael building the Kaaba, there is a reference to the change of the Qibla. And I think I probably should just, again, read the Penguin translation. There's a sort of polemic going on with Christians and Jews. So I'll start with that. Do you claim that Abraham, Ishmael, Isaac, Jacob, and the tribes are all Jews or Christians? Do you know better than Allah himself? Who is more wicked than the man who hides a testimony which he has received from Allah? He is watching over all your actions. Those nations have passed away. Theirs is what they did, and yours what you have done. You shall not be questioned about their actions. Now the crucial passage. The foolish will ask, what has made them change their Qibla? Now this is a very, very late surah. Say, so this is what Muhammad says, the east and the west are Allah's. He guides whom he will to the right path. We have made you a just nation so that you may testify against mankind, and that your own apostle may testify against you. We decreed your former Qibla only in order that we might know the apostle's true adherents, and those who were to disown him. It was indeed a hard test, but not to those whom Allah guided. He was not to make your faith fruitless. He is compassionate and merciful to men. So, basically, the Muslims had been told to change the Qibla. They're questioning why it is, and the answer is produced that it was a test. It was a test for 6 years, I'd say, at Medina. Now, the Sirah disguises this because it has a brief note with nothing to explain it, saying that the Qibla was changed within a year of the Hijrah to Medina. But I think the conclusion from the Quran and the biography of the Prophet is absolutely plain, that Muhammad signalled his willingness to reach a deal with Mecca, 1, by changing the Qibla, 2, by wanting to go on the small pilgrimage, and that this opened the way for the negotiations which brought together and cemented and basically created the explosive mixture of a great mercantile managerial city and the faithful.
Okay, so we've had an hour of throat clearing. Perhaps we can now launch the attack out of the Arabian pilgrimage. And do we know why it starts? Because once it starts, it's like a whirlwind.
We know that Muhammad, who died before the conquest started, that Muhammad was interested in winning over the peoples to the north, and was basically encouraged northern expeditions before his death. So I think the Prophet, who was a prophet of all mankind, had it in mind to spread the message outside Arabia. The actual, so I would say the impulse is prophetic. What happened at Muhammad's death was that the effect of the treaty with Mecca and the opening of the whole of Arabia to proselytizing by the Muslims had been to create a sort of fragile union of Arabia, the tribes paying deference to Muhammad. But when he died, the deference which was paid to the Prophet ceased. So they've then followed what are called the Ridda Wars, the wars of independence. But in fact, it's where the Mecca-Medinan complex imposed its authority by force on the Arabian Peninsula, basically in 632 and 633. So unified, then it's going to turn outwards, as it did in 634.
And what happens in 634?
This is where I rely on non-Muslim sources to establish the absolute key fixed points. And I can give you a very simple account of the conquest of the Roman and Sasanian provinces. Basically, on key points, Greek, Armenian and Syriac sources, that is, Roman and also Persian, I mean the people writing in those languages, enable one to establish the key points. So, February 634, well, in fact, we're given a day of the week and a day of the month, Friday the 4th of February 634. A crucial victory was won inland from Gaza.
Is that where the poor old Roman commander is sewn up in a camel hide or something?
No, that's one of the tales we've got in the Sira, which one is not, in the Futu, the accounts of the conquest, which is a sort of embroidery. So I'm basically giving you the skeleton that we can get from the non-Muslim sources. And it doesn't, yes, and the point should be made that it doesn't, the Muslim account of the conquest of Palestine and Syria only, partially accords with the independent evidence. So you've got this first victory where basically the Muslims have got up the rich coastlands of Palestine. Then we hear that in 635, probably early 635, all the cities of Palestine submit to the Muslims, including Jerusalem. And 635 and 636, until early 636, the armies move north and conquer Syria. Now, that's not what there are three different traditions about the conquest of Syria in Islamic sources, and they weren't at all sure how to do it, because, you see, they viewed the Caliph Umar's triumphal visit to Jerusalem in 638 as the culminating point of the battle for Palestine and Syria. So they have Arab armies attacking in the north and in the south, and they're in rather a muddle about the sequence of battles and campaigns. But they've simply, the caliphal visit was like Heraclius' visit. It was a triumphal visit to the holy city, and it basically marked the victory of the Arab Muslims in the Middle East. And that victory had occurred. That victory was a victory not only in Syria, in Palestine and Syria, achieved by 636, but in Mesopotamia, because Mesopotamia was the first invasion in force was in 636, and then the Muslims pushed right over the alluvium, that is over the Tigris, the Euphrates and Tigris, to besiege the Persian capital, Ctesiphon of Ardashir. There then followed in 637 a Persian counterattack, which drove the Arabs back. There is a record of this in the Muslim sources. It's the terrible Battle of the Bridge when they were defeated and driven back. They were driven back over the Euphrates to the edge of the desert. And it was there, and again we've got a precise date, on the 6th of January, 638, that summons having been issued all over Arabia, an Arab army confronted the full Persian army at Qadisiyah, 6th of January 638, and won a victory, and then was able to advance back over the Euphrates to the Tigris to besiege the Persian capital, which eventually, after a botched relief expedition, fell early in 640.
And so you could argue that that battle on the edge of the desert was probably one of the most important battles in world history?
Yes, indeed. And it's very, very important. And we get the precise date from an Armenian source. And of course, it shows the fighting power of the Persians. I mean, basically, the Persians, supposedly defeated in the last Great War, put up far more of a fight than the Romans did.
I was just wondering if Heraclius might not have been advised to go to the aid of the Persians. Well,
of course, Heraclius was still ruling at the time of the Gaza defeat, at the time of the submission of Palestine, at the time of the defeat in Syria. And after that defeat in Syria, he basically despaired of holding those lands. For the moment, I'm sure all Romans thought that this was just another nightmare like the Persian occupation, and that the Arabs would be driven out, and that's why the cities submitted to avoid suffering too much damage. They would just await a return of the Romans.
Can I just ask about that? What happens when you submit? Are you taken as a slave? Do you just have to pay taxes under the new government? What's the relationship of the citizens and subjects in the new regime?
Basically, to submit rather than to be conquered meant that you retained your liberty, that the local arrangements remained the same. Your taxes went to a different authority.
Right.
And you preserved your rich, your suburban properties, your vineyards, your orchards, your villas outside the city were safe.
And then gradually over time, as I understand it, it becomes more and more uncomfortable to remain a Jew or a Christian in Arab lands.
I think only from the 690s, you see, the religion was a religion which was open, it was inclusive, it was ready to welcome Christians and Jews. And I think there was an expectation by the early caliphs that they would be coming over en masse. It was simply the third revelation, the latest. And it was when they had not done so, after the Second Civil War, which lasted from 682 to 92, that the Muslim authorities began to impose restrictions.
And as I understand it, there were a couple of sieges of Constantinople, and they're not necessarily exactly in our period because they're maybe just a little bit later. But did that not change the theology of Islam in the sense that when they fail to capture the city, they sort of have to acknowledge that the end of days is not yet quite upon us?
Yes. There was a first attack on the city in 654. We've got a good contemporary Armenian source for that. There was a second blockade, which some sources say lasted for 7 years, but in fact it's a sort of single calendar year, 670 to 671, when the main Roman fleet had been lured west to Carthage. And then there's a third great siege in 717 to 718, that was full-scale siege, and that ended in abject failure, which did lead to a lot of reconsideration on the Muslim side. And the Caliph of the time, Umar II, one of the ways in which, as it were, his reputation was preserved was he was transformed into the one really godly, devout, pious Umayyad ruler who was concerned with faith, and was then accepted by the following Abbasid dynasty as the one Umayyad Caliph who was a good man and a pious man. So it's a complete repolishing of his image.
And the Roman Empire has now been, well, I suppose it's reduced to a rump, isn't it? How are they able to resist? Because they haven't got much left compared to what they had.
Yes, what they've got left is Anatolia. So behind it's got defensible frontier mountains, the islands of the Aegean, southern Italy. In the 640s, 650s until basically the 690s, North Africa. So yes, it's much reduced, but basically it fights back. The Romans continue to behave as an imperial people, exchanging blows, fighting conventional war against the Muslims, until that really dangerous siege of Constantinople in 717 to 718. And after that, they realized that they're simply not up to it. And the secret of their survival is, I suppose there are three explanations. One, geography is on their side. There's a line of frontier mountains separating their lands from the advanced Muslim lands in northern Syria and later Cilicia. Secondly, there's their own Christian faith. Thirdly, they develop a complete form and successful form of guerrilla defence. It's guerrilla warfare. And, well, I suppose, in the state, if anything, becomes stronger. I mean, it's got a smaller base. It becomes more effective. So the whole thing is pretty effectively managed. But it's nonetheless an extraordinary feat. But I just want to digress to give the key dates about the conquest of Iran, because the Battle of Qadisiyah was not the end of it. You see, the Battle of Qadisiyah basically left Mesopotamia, the lowlands, exposed, but there still remained the formidable task of conquering highland Iran, that is, modern Iran, the core territory of modern Iran. Basically, there were two distinct offensives. The first offensive is 642, and it follows the victory at Nihavand in the northern Zagros Mountains. After which, in 642, Media, western Iran, and the southern edge of the plateau are conquered. Then in 643, push further north, the northern edge of the plateau is conquered, Azerbaijan is conquered, and 3 raiding forays are sent west over what I call Transcaucasia, Armenia and Georgia. Then in 644, they push further north to Derbend, which was the fortress controlling the Caspian gates on the Caspian, which submits. So basically, in 3 years, the whole western half of Iran is conquered.
But this is absolutely extraordinary, because the Romans have never managed to achieve anything remotely like this.
Indeed.
And the Romans of Trajan's day were not lacking in military prowess, and yet they didn't come close.
No. And basically, these troops basically were on a forward base of Kufa in what's now Iraq. There was some action on a southern front at the same time, an attack on Khuzestan, which is still in Iran. It's the bit of Iran north of the Tigris. It's where the Iran-Iraq war was fought. Their truce was agreed. Then in 642, there was a renewed attack. Khuzestan was conquered. So that was what was happening on the south. There was also raiding across the Gulf from Arabia, and the establishment of a forward base on an island on the Iranian side of the Gulf, and then on an inland base near modern Bushehr, from which forces pushed north to secure another crossing of the Zagros, known as the Persian Gates. So by 645, western Iran was in Muslim hands. The Gulf coast was in Muslim hands, and they'd got a bridgehead on the the eastern side of the Zagros in Persia proper, Fars. There's then a pause till 649, and in 649, in 3 years, the whole of Fars, Kirman, Khorasan were conquered, basically by forces from Basra, and they moved out further east to Merv, Mervarud, and Balkh in what is now Balkh in Afghanistan.
Gosh.
And the last Shah was killed in 652. And meanwhile, Egypt is conquered in mere campaigns that started in autumn 640, ended in an armistice on November 643 of 11 months to allow the Romans to withdraw.
And what's life like for the conquerors? What do they get out of this? Do they take over the estates of the Iranians? What's life like for the conquerors?
Well, now you're pressing me into areas. Well, basically, the conquerors at first, they sort of huddled together in garrison towns of their own. So Kufa and Basra in Iraq were their two great bases from which they projected authority over the whole of Mesopotamia. So that basically there's very little mixing of conquerors and conquered. there within Iran, the the general principle is they establish garrisons at key points, and Derbend is a key point on the the northern edge of Iran, on the edge of the Caucasus. So are Merv and Merv Rud. So you've got, as it were, the colonial centres from which officials would be travelling round. But so basically, it's a sort of light occupation, not too much impact on the conquered peoples, save for they continue to pay their taxes, but to different authorities.
I'm just trying to think. When the Romans conquered somewhere, they enslaved large numbers of people, and one gets the sense that life in Rome was good because, the wealth of the Mediterranean world flowed into Rome. And I'm just trying to understand if for the Arab high-ups, if they had a similar sort of dominant lifestyle.
Oh, yes. Well, you've got wealth, you see, flowing, where it's flowing, wherever they are in the garrison towns, the Arabs are profiting from having a share in the revenue that's gathered in the Diwan. But it's in the central, it's in the Hijaz and in Medina that a new plutocratic life develops. And I know very little about this, but I think there's a lot of literature generated at the time. And you see, palatial complexes being built and people living luxuriously. So yes, the center is now Medina, not Ctesiphon ve Ardashir, not Antioch. It's Medina. And then in the course of time, of course, cities will develop that far outshine anything in the Sasanian past or Achaemenid past within the Iranian world, which will become the economic motor of the Caliphate, well, indeed of the Western Eurasia in the 9th and 10th centuries. So immense prosperity, itself brought on by active trade and active manufacture. It's a new world. Oh, and also, incidentally, the surplus grain from Egypt stopped going to Constantinople. In 644, the Arabs cleared out the old canal built by Trajan, connecting the Nile with the Red Sea. And the Caliph Umar, shortly before his assassination, went down to Jar to watch the arrival of the first grain convoy from Egypt. So, the necessary nourishment for the plutocrats of Medina was being shipped in.
And the world is tilting on its axis.
Yes, indeed.
Right. Have we reached the end point, or is there something more that we should be talking about before we finish?
No, I think we probably have. You did in your preliminary your sort of list of questions talk about the civil wars. So I suppose just a final word ought to be said that yes, at first there was this extraordinary unifying of Arabia and sort of cohesive sort of military expansive entity that carries out the conquests between 634 and 652. But by in the 650s, there are very serious political arguments going on at a high level in the Caliphate, exacerbated by a series of reverses, the first of which was the reverse before a failure to take Constantinople in 654. So then civil war breaks out, and that's where the Medinan Meccan split first shows.
So that split is still there, still carrying on.
Yes, I mean the Meccans are all, they're Muslims, but it is the son of Abu Sufyan, Muawiyah, who wins that civil war. But his victory is partly to be explained by basically the folly of Ali, much revered throughout Iran, and Ali, I think, managed to alienate everyone, And the non-Islamic sources make it plain that he was assassinated long before the end of that civil war. I think it's 658. The war ends in 661. So Ali, is much sort of like Umar II. His image is much polished subsequently, but Ali was completely hopeless as a political and military leader. So he alienated, as it were, the Meccan establishment. He also alienated the wilder elements among the Muslims, the antecedents of modern jihadists. Well, then Muawiyah has a long reign as caliph, and it's at the end of his reign that a new split develops between, which is basically characterized as a split between northerners and southerners. But I think it's not actually between northerners and southerners. I think it's between two nexuses of political allies at Muawiyah's court. But there are lots of there are regional interests and others. So that's a civil war that lasts for 10 years.
And yet two questions, and we really should finish off. But is the Arab world at this time particularly susceptible to civil war, or is this just the nature of states at that time? And secondly, it seems to do nothing to diminish their energy.
The two civil wars did provide opportunities for Byzantium to consolidate itself in the first one, and basically to launch a series of counterattacks during the second one. But there was a rapid return to aggression after Muawiyah's victory in 661, and before long in the 660s. Muawiyah is setting about the use of naval power and expanding over the Mediterranean. And the same is true in 692. That's then followed by the completion of the conquest of North Africa, and then a thrust outwards into Central Asia. And it's after 692 that the sign that really is a new regime, a new sort of world power exists, is manifest in the issuing of the first pure Muslim coinage, which is it's both it's gold and it's silver. Gold basically for the Roman provinces, silver for the Persian, and it's aniconic. There's no image on it, and indeed there is no name of a ruler. It's the coinage is issued in the name of God.
So what is written on it?
Basically, it's a shortened version of the Declaration of Faith. There is no God but Allah. And I can't remember whether there is I don't think there is any anti-Christian or anti-Jewish statement. It's a sort of summary of what was the declarations put up in the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, which is also being built at this time. So basically, it's in the 690s that the new state really imposes itself on the peoples that it has conquered. It imposes itself, as one can see through the currency, and it ceases to be as tolerant as it had been before. And I think it starts to react to the use of imagery by Christians and finds itself being pushed towards a sort of more iconoclast stance.
Possibly or possibly not picked up by the Byzantines in due course. Okay, let's leave it there. But before I just finish off completely, you don't have to answer this. I was very struck reading your book. I felt that you had a huge respect and admiration for Islam, so I would just like to have a declaration from you of your own religious faith.
You're quite right. I have a huge admiration and respect for Islam, which grew out of the initial reading of the Quran in translation. I have a huge admiration and respect for the Prophet Muhammad. And I say that because I of course, I am also a historian, so that has led me to a view which is not an orthodox view about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, but which I think is, to get it right, enables one to understand what happened. As regards my own faith, well, funnily, I've just been on a skiing holiday with my daughter, son-in-law, and 2 grandsons, and so the subject came up, and I was asked, and actually I didn't answer at the time. Both the daughter and the son-in-law did, and the 2 grandsons. I think that I would describe myself as a deist. I certainly don't accept that things like the Big Bang, or life, or consciousness, or will ever be explicable in scientific terms. I mean, the Big Bang theory is, in fact, and I did once give a paper to this in a learned seminar on causation. The Big Bang, in which nothing exists. I mean, everything is confined to a point which is non-existent in space. And then the next moment, everything exists. Well, that seems to me actually a description of creation. And you read the Quran, and there, and I did actually quote this. I said, God simply has to say be, and it is.
Yeah.
And I'm much more attracted by Islam because it's monotheist, without all the complications of Christianity, than Christianity. But obviously I was brought up a Christian, so... but on the other hand, one is open to other notions of I very much liked... I once had a conversation with an Indian businessman, I think, who said, it's so extraordinary, Christianity. There are these people who are going to be condemned forever. Whereas, in Hinduism, eventually you all get there. And I'm a deist. And so fundamentally rather sympathetic to Islam, say for its more extreme manifestations.
Okay, we'll leave it there. But thank you, James, again so much for your generosity with your time and for your learning. That was another tour de force, so thank you so much.
Thank you, Russell.
Well, that's the end of today's podcast. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, then I have a big favour to ask. I don't look to make any money from the podcast. There's no advertising or anything like that. I just do this because I enjoy speaking to the guests, and I'm keen for them to get as big a audience as possible because I think they are really, really good people. So if you could share it on whatever social media channel you use, tweet it out, whatever it is, and even better if you could leave a review on iTunes, that would be absolutely fantastic. Anyway, goodbye for now.